This is Join Us in France, episode 319. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and today I bring you a conversation with Elyse about the life and times of Louis Pasteur. There was a time when France was at the forefront of science and research, and Pasteur was definitely one of the major reasons why. There is a Pasteur Museum in Paris. It's in the 15th arrondissement at 25 Rue du Docteur Roux. Isn't that a great practice for French? Rue Roux. So it's 25 Rue du Docteur Roux. But it is closed for the foreseeable future because of the pandemic, of course, but also for renovations. But their website is open and full of great information. Please check it out before you visit so you can see the opening date. And there will be a link in the show notes for that. And where do you see the show notes? On your podcast app or on joinusinfrance.com/319 numeral. And I have a long personal update also after my conversation with Elyse because there's a lot happening. Thank you, patrons, for giving me a precious gift, the time to produce this podcast. By becoming a patron, you join the team of folks who love France and want to hear all about it through this podcast, and I'm sure other ways too. There will be a shout out to new patrons after the interview. A big thank you also to all of you who buy my cookbook, Join Us at the Table, and my voice map tours of Paris, or make purchases through my Amazon affiliate links. You are keeping me afloat, and I appreciate that very, very much. The best way to see all of that is by going to joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And the best way to stay in touch with me and with the podcast is to sign up for the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. I'm working on a free France travel planner for my newsletter subscribers. It's in progress. I hope it'll come out soon. It'll be out before you can travel to France for sure. Merci, madame. Bonne année.
Bonne année. And let's hope that for everyone, everywhere, 2021 is a better year than the one we've just left behind.
Yes, please. I'm ready for that.
Please. Yes.
Ready for that. Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about Pasteur, Louis Pasteur, one of the most famous scientists ever, and also happens to be French.
And also, by some chance, happens to be French.
Yeah. So you're going to give us like a little bit of background on vaccines, and then I'll talk about Pasteur specifically.
Your hero, one of your real heroes.
He's a hero of mine, yes.
Yeah, and obviously, I guess maybe people out there can realize that one of the reasons this seems so topical, of course, is because of what's going on right now in the world. But I think it's true that everybody, certainly I, associate Pasteur with vaccines and vaccination. And yet there's so much to this story, so much more than what we, I guess, take for granted because we are here at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. But the backstory, I like, it's a strange word that's now become very popular. The backstory is actually as fascinating. It's funny when you think about it. I don't know how much I've actually thought about it until we started talking about doing this podcast. But, from when did we talk about vaccination and vaccine? I mean, do you ever think about things like that? And it turns out that even though Pasteur was the one who, what's the right word? He professionalized it, and he made it available to everybody practically in the world through his work and everything. The concept goes back very, very, very far. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the history of it, in fact, the word vaccine, which we'll talk about in a little while, was not what they used, but it it goes back really to, strangely enough, to both China and to Africa in pre-colonial times. I mean, so there were different groups of people, but we know more about the Chinese situation because they were literate and they had writing and they documented all of this. And the scourge for the world, all over the world, was smallpox.
Yeah.
And has been for, I guess, a couple of thousand years. Even during the times of the ancient Greeks and probably the Egyptians. And in China, probably through trial and error, it came about that starting in the 1400s, they started using the pus. I know. I'm sorry, everybody. Don't listen to this while you're eating. Really. They started the pustules, which are the little kind of horrible pimples with pus in them that form when you have smallpox, which is, of course, why you get scarred for having it. How they found this? Probably it was peasants, because it's always peasants that seem to know by trial and error these kinds of things. But anyway, they realized that by taking the pus of the people who already had it and putting it in a scratch that would expose, to the skin so that it could get inside the blood system to healthy people, that it kept them from getting very, very sick.
Right.
I don't know if it kept them from having it at all. I'm not even sure if that's possible with smallpox, if there's such a thing as a mild case or not. I really don't know. But by trial and error, they realized that this was a method for preventing the spreading of smallpox to masses of people. And so it was written up in the 15th century in China, and thanks to the Silk Road, the route de soie, as they say, and Marco Polo and all of that, which of course goes back all the way to the 1200s. This information traveled with traders from China going east and wound up in the area of Anatolia, of what became the Ottoman Empire, which of course is now basically Turkey. And in Turkey, this method was used practically everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's rather amazing because nobody really wrote about it or talked about it. It wasn't like, oh, we've discovered this wonderful thing. It just was, it's like,
right.
This is the way.
It was trial and error because they just noticed for a long, long time that, with smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, mumps, that if you had it once, you would never get it again.
Exactly.
It was like a miracle. But sometimes, they tried to inoculate healthy subjects, but sometimes it killed them. So it was really risky. It was really risky.
It was very risky.
But again, these diseases killed you. It killed a lot of people too. So, maybe it was a reasonable risk to take sometimes.
But that's what makes it so interesting is that the Chinese even knew this. And this is one of the things that they wrote up, was that they knew that it was a way to keep people from getting smallpox, but sometimes they did get it from this form of what they called inoculation. That is, by taking the infected pus and putting it into somebody else. There was, in fact, a mortality of up to 2%. So this was a method that worked, but there were high risks to it. Yeah. And then, of course, we get to what really is the history that interests us because it really leads up to Pasteur. And that is, at the end of the 1600s, there is this British English woman, Lady Mary Werkley Montague. I love the name. I don't know why. I just love this name.
Yeah.
She was a fascinating woman, honestly. I did some more reading about her. She was a real, very well-educated. She was the daughter of I think it was a duke or something, and she was extremely well-educated, and she was very much an independent, free thinker. And she did something that was unheard of at the time. It has nothing to do with vaccines. She had a marriage of love. She chose the man she wanted to marry, and they ran off. And luckily for her, he was also the son of somebody that was like a baron or a count or a duke or something like that. So even though they chose each other, this was not a shameful marriage. And it turns out that her husband was named ambassador to Constantinople, to the Ottoman Empire. And so in the year 1716, they were already married and had a couple of kids. She went with him to Constantinople, which of course is Istanbul. And while he was doing his ambassador work, she, being someone who couldn't stand being idle and bored, learned Turkish and chose to explore the city and spend time with the women who were in the harem. And, of course, the word harem is a Turkish word that, of course, we all know now. This is the part of the huge palace where all of his concubines and wives and everything were. And they kept the small children with them. They stayed with them, I don't know until what age, but boy or girl, probably up until the age of 9 or 10, they stayed with them. And what she discovered was that they were doing this form of inoculation with their children. She had a brother who died of smallpox, and she had had it, and she had marks from it. And so she was very curious to know why in Constantinople there was so little evidence of people dying of it or having had it.
Yeah.
And when she spent a lot of time with these women, she discovered that what they were doing with these with their children was the same thing that, in fact, the Chinese had talked about. That is, that they would make scratches on either the arms or legs, and they would have these vials that had the active pus, or whatever you want to call it, actually, and they would take it and they would rub it into the skin of the children, and they would get inflamed, and they might have a little bit of sickness for a day or two. And then that was it. They did not die from it, and that was basically what the entire population was doing. And she was so impressed by this that in Constantinople, she had her son, who was 8, given the same treatment because she was so afraid of him dying as her brother had died. And when they went back to England, which was 2.5 years later, she showed this method. She went to see the Royal College of Surgeons in London. And, of course, she was an aristocrat, so they would listen to her, even though, of course, she was a woman, and they were certainly not going to listen to her that well because she was a woman. But she insisted on telling them about this method that she'd seen. And she had her daughter, who was only 4 or 5 at the time, she had her had the same thing done to her while they were in front of all these doctors. And the Prince of Wales, who was about to become King George I, was there. And he was so impressed because so many people in his family had actually died from it that he insisted on having his 2 daughters inoculated with the same method as well. And, of course, there was a lot of speculation that this was just nonsense because it was coming from a woman, which is always something that annoys me. Really, a lot.
Yeah.
But, in fact, it was quite an amazing thing. And then what happened? So this is in 1720-something, 21, I think. And then what happened was that the doctors started really wondering about whether this was a possibility or not. Now, something else, I just want to add this in because it had to do with the fact that I was telling my sisters that we did this podcast, and one of my sisters, my sister Barbara, said to me, "Did you know that George Washington did the same thing?" And I said, "What?" And sure enough, I went back and did some more research, and this technique, which was introduced in England in the early 1720s, was brought to the colonies. And so by the time we get to George Washington and the Army and the War of Independence, which is before Edward Jenner actually develops the technique that becomes what we call vaccination, he actually did this with his soldiers. He wanted to make sure that they could die of cold because they had no clothes, and the rivers were frozen, but that they weren't going to die of smallpox.
Right.
So it was a technique that was unofficial, but that people were using.
Oh, sure.
And then what happens is, over the course of time, you get other English doctors and researchers who want to refine this, because this whole idea of the risk involved is very important. And then at the end of the 1700s, this is the person who gave the idea to Pasteur, who, of course, carried it forward.
Right.
You have Edward Jenner.
Yeah.
And he is the one who invented the word vaccine. He invented the word. Instead of talking about inoculation, he used the term vaccine.
Yeah.
He took a little boy, probably a waif that had no family. I mean, it is hard to think that this is what they were doing, but that's exactly what they were doing. But also, and this is, again, shows the sign of the times, they took 6 prisoners who were condemned to die, and he gave them an option. He said, if you accept this trial of vaccination, if you don't die, you are free.
Right.
And they all took it, and they all were freed.
Right. And the same happened with Pasteur. He proposed, and he went a step further. He actually wrote to people in third world countries, to rulers in third world countries, and offered, can we experiment on some of your prisoners?
Oh, really?
Not nice.
Yeah, right.
Not nice.
And so just before we get to Pasteur, so what Jenner did was he realized that one of the problems with this older method was that using the active, tell me, is it virus or bacteria? Because I should know, but I don't. That's in smallpox.
I think these are viruses.
I think it's a virus. He said, it was a little too dangerous. And what he did was, because he noticed that the milkmaids in the countryside, which of course was really predominant at that time anyway in England, never got smallpox, ever. And so he said, I bet it's because they're contaminated by what's called cowpox, which is a cousin that's slightly less dangerous and not lethal to humans. And so what he did was he took the variole, the pustules, whatever you want to call them, from the cowpox, and he used that.
Right.
And he in that, because the word in Latin vacca is cow, he called it a vaccine.
There you go.
And that's how he got the word vaccine.
Vaccine.
That's what, and then it became not inoculation but vaccination. And from there, we move forward, and we get to your hero, Louis Pasteur.
Yeah. So he was. The interesting thing about Pasteur is that he was not really destined for anything like that. If you look at his origins, he came from generations of farmers in the Franche-Comté area. So that's the region along the Swiss border. Besançon is the capital. His grandfather had left the farm to become a soldier in Napoleon's army. And then his father ran a successful tannery. And he was a kind man who valued education, and he was really eager to send his son to study in Paris. Pasteur, as a kid, was, nobody could tell that he was going to be this genius kid. He was the kid who always doodled, and they thought, maybe they worried that he might become an artist,
Oh, God forbid.
Nothing like that,
Right.
So his father always pushed him to become a professor. That's what he had in mind for him. So he went to high school in Besançon, which was a boarding school situation because he was from a small city of Arbois, is what it's called. And Arbois didn't have a high school, so you had to go to boarding school.
Right.
He did his baccalaureate with a specialization in Greek, Latin, and literature. He didn't get wonderful grades, but he did great in all the science subjects. He wasn't so good at history and geography. Then he applied for the École Normale because his father wanted him to be a professor, right? And that's where you go if you want to become a professor. And he studied the sciences. After 3 years, he had his degree in physical science. And at that point, he could have been sent off to teach somewhere in rural France because that's how it works.
It worked, yeah.
Even today, you become a teacher and then they send you wherever they want. But he got hired to be an assistant at the École Normale, the laboratory. So he started grad school is what it is. And he got his PhD in chemistry. He wrote his PhD on the molecular structure of crystals, sulfurs, and salts.
Sounds fascinating.
Fascinating, yes.
Yes.
And so he was able to solve a major problem that had been a problem for his predecessors. It's about the plane of polarization of crystals. Don't ask me any questions. I don't know.
I don't know. I won't.
Yes. But he was invented to present his discovery at the Collège de France in the Latin Quarter, so very prestigious for young men from Podunk, Besançon, Arbois. Yeah. Then he became a physics professor in Dijon. That's where his first appointment was. He didn't love that he had to leave Paris, but there you go. That's the life of a professor in France, in the French system anyway. And later on, they assigned him to teach at the University of Strasbourg as a chemistry teacher, and he stayed there for 5 years, and that's where he met the daughter of the university president. Her name was Marie Laurent, and he was love at first sight. He asked for her hand in marriage within 2 weeks of meeting her.
Oh, how romantic.
Yes, very nice. And they made, it was a great match, as a matter of fact, because, this was very traditional France. They had 5 kids together. She dedicated her life to his well-being and the well-being of their children, and she was really, really good at it. But she was also bright. She did a lot of editing of his work, of his writings.
Yeah. Right.
She was a very highly educated.
A good secretary.
Exactly, she was an extremely well-educated woman, and so I don't think he could have achieved everything that he achieved without her, to tell you the truth. But
that's usually the way it is, Annie. You know that.
Yeah, it often like that. Yes. Then he was named the dean of the chemistry faculty in Lille, and that's when he started to work on fermentation.
Yep.
Germ theory and fermentation, and that led to the pasteurization process. So what he was able to prove is that fermentation was due to the presence of living cells called yeasts.
Yeah.
He researched how yeast works in beer, in wine, in vinegar, in bread, and even in cheese. And this was a very practical field to study in France, where food production is a major business still to this day.
And I would have guessed that at the time, still, food that goes bad was a source of illness and death for a lot of people. So this was very important in terms of health as well.
Yeah, and they had to throw away a lot of the production because they were, just like with the vaccines, they were working from trial and error. It was their experience that led them to work with a specific method, but they didn't know, So this professor who shows up and can solve problems, that means that production is more efficient. Well, they loved him, obviously.
And one of the things I noticed in reading a little bit too is that, interestingly, they say that before that, most of the scientists would turn up their nose at the idea of helping industry, and he became famous too because he didn't think that was a problem, that science should be at the service of industry as well.
Sure. So to give you an instance, in vinegar production, he studied the process and experimented with it until he could give vinegar producers a process with rules to follow that never failed.
Right.
So it took him a full year, but he found the formula to make vinegar every time. This included hygiene, how much product to use, how long to wait, all that sort of thing. Right. And obviously they loved him because you can make better money if you never have to waste any of your production, right?
Exactly.
Right. And same with the silkworms. He didn't know anything about silkworms when he started, but he figured out why so many silkworms got sick and died. And the producers so far, they were relying on superstition. They were trying to, stuff like spraying sulfur and ashes and ground mustard and things like that. But it did no good, right? It turned out that most of the silkworms that were used in France carried a pathogen. And this pathogen sometimes caused disease and death, and sometimes not. There were a lot of healthy carriers that passed it on without getting sick themselves.
Well, that sounds familiar, right?
Yes, with COVID, we know that happens a lot.
Right.
So the only way, but this does not happen with COVID. The only way to get rid of this pathogen was to kill the healthy carriers. We're talking worms here, okay?
Right.
So how do you know who is a healthy carrier? Well, you keep track of their progeny. When the disease appears in the second or third generation, you got to get rid of the parents. And so by doing that over time, he isolated families of healthy worms. And unfortunately, that meant killing lots of worms and that didn't appear to be sick, right? They appeared healthy. So this was not a popular idea. A mob of angry farmers started trying to stone him. Anyway, not everybody loved him, especially in his day. But he saved a lot of productions. Now, another thing that was really important in Pasteur is that he showed that spontaneous generation is not a thing.
Is not a thing, exactly.
Not a thing. People thought that when a liquid started to ferment, it was because microbes kind of spontaneously appeared within the liquid. He showed that this cannot be the case, and invisible microbes carried in dust in the air, they're the ones who bring the problem into the liquids. He used vials that he straight neck, curb neck, you open them, you close them, you expose them to air in different places, whatever. He did all that sort of experimentation. And that's how he started to become popular with the general public, because everybody was fascinated with this business of spores and germs in the air. It's kind of... It
is when you think about it, really.
It was all new to people. And he showed that heat kills germs, and that's still the process we use called pasteurization. One example of that is the shelf-safe milk and the cream that we use in France. This is possible because of something called ultra-high temperature processing. I think it's called Tetra Pak in the U.S.
Oh, is that? Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So once milk is processed that way, you can store it on the shelf until you open it, because once you open it, new germs might get in, right?
Right.
Do you think that changes the taste of the milk? I don't, but I don't drink milk.
Yeah.
Oh, you can tell. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's just, when I first came to France, I thought it was awful, disgusting, and I couldn't stand it, even when I put it in my coffee and tea. But I've just gotten used to it,
Yeah.
But every once in a while, I will go to the supermarket and buy a liter of fresh milk.
Yeah, fresh milk, yeah.
Yeah, it really is different.
Yeah.
It really is.
Right, and it is a bit of a funny thing that France is the country in the world that eats the most raw milk cheese compared to all the other countries. I think in the U.S. it's not even allowed.
I don't think it is allowed, but you have to, only in certain places you will find it. Yeah.
Right. So in France, we eat a lot of raw milk cheeses, which is kind of funny because we are the country of Pasteur. But even in France, raw cheeses are not recommended for kids under 2 or for pregnant
women.
Pregnant women, older people, immune suppressed people. So we do know that it's not completely free of risk. It could make you sick. But I've never gotten sick from eating fromage au lait cru.
No, but it is, the other irony is that there is so much cheese in France, and a lot of it is with raw milk, but the milk itself as milk is almost all pasteurized or UHT milk. I mean, very few people use fresh milk here.
Yeah.
I think it's because in France, most people, adults, don't drink milk. They use it for cooking.
Right, that's right. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about Pasteur's life. He faced lots of personal problems mixed in with all this work. 2 of his daughters died. His father died. The students went on strike at the École Normale. He was still arguing with the old guard scientists about spontaneous generation. He didn't have a really good lab to conduct his experiments in Paris. So all of these things interrupted his work at different times in his life.
Right.
But he always returned to trying to solve problems, and he wasn't ever satisfied until he understood what was happening with, he wanted to dissect the problem and get to the root of it, what's really happening. And he did this by following the scientific method, which is, you have to observe, write down, and try to prove yourself wrong. You postulate something. You say, "Oh, I think this is what's happening," and then you look and see if you might be wrong about that or you might be right about that.
He seems to have had, really born with what we could call the scientific spirit.
Yeah.
To observe and to test and to observe and to test and keep going and keep going. That's what's so amazing about him.
Right, right. He never gave up. And
gave up.
As a result, he has received every, honor ever bestowed upon scientists, not just in France, but all over the world. And he always responded to all of these honors with humility. He said, "My parents and my country made me great," and he was not boastful, I guess.
Right.
He was kind of a humble man by nature. Now, he's most famous for work on contagious diseases, but like you mentioned, he did not invent the first vaccine, and he was standing on the shoulders of giants. He was just trying to... he knew all about the work of the people that had come before him, and he tried to move further along, move the science further along. But
then, of course, he'd made all of these vaccines, and of course, the one that you always talk about, which is so important, which is against rabies, right?
Yeah. So, but before we get to rabies, he did anthrax as well, and this is what brought him fame because, so he knew about attenuated vaccines, right? And he showed... He inoculated. Let me cut it short. He got access to 50 sheep, and he was working with a veterinarian. At first, most of his discoveries were in veterinary medicine, because again, industry needed help. They had all of these sheep and cows that would die all of a sudden. They wanted help, and so he found a vet who gave him access to 50 sheep. He inoculated 25 of them and did nothing to the other 25. And a while later, he came back and he injected all 50 sheep with a virulent form of anthrax. And the 25 that had been inoculated lived, and the ones that hadn't been all died. So this demonstration convinced everyone, because it was like, they were certain that he was correct about his theories, but doctors were not so sure about this Pasteur character who trained as a chemist and now claimed he could cure serious diseases. And that's when he decided to double down and try his theories with rabies, a dreadful disease that kills 100% of those who contract it. Be they human or mammal or, it kills everything that it touches. Now, I cannot say enough that rabies was one of the most horrible cause of death for any animal or human. Any mammal can get rabies, and it was most frequently seen in dogs because feral dogs would fight with domesticated dogs and then bring the disease to humans. There were all sorts of stories about how you could cure rabies, but it never worked, ever. Any child who had the disease had to be suffocated between two mattresses before he infected the rest of his family. It was just dreadful. It was just dreadful. Now, he tested rabies vaccine protocol on various animals for 4 years before he tested it on a child. He, just from casual observation, he had concluded that rabies was a neurological disease. So he took bone marrow from rabbits who had died of rabies and experimented with it. His method was to let the infected bone marrow dry out in the open air. He thought that exposure to air was doing the job of attenuating the virulence. We now know that he wasn't quite correct about that, but exposure to air plus time worked. So he lucked out. Science has now advanced far enough that they understand that he was wrong on many of his premises. But it worked because the longer you let this infected bone marrow dry out, the less rabies you will have in it. And eventually he arrived at a protocol. He'd inject 14-day-old rabbit marrow into a dog. Then he'd do 13-day-old rabbit marrow, and then and on until he got to the point where he could inject this same dog with virulent rabies, and the dog survived. So one day, a desperate mother from Alsace came to Pasteur with her son, whose name was Joseph Meisner, I think, Meiser. He was 9 years old. He had been bitten by a rabid dog. His mother knew that he would die because there was nothing worked before. So against medical recommendations, she sought out Pasteur and convinced him to inoculate her son. And he started by inoculating him with the least virulent dosage and then increased the dose slowly. And 2 months after he was bitten, the boy still hadn't developed any signs of rabies.
Any signs at all? Wow.
None.
Yeah.
Or it was called hydrophobia at the time. Because apparently rabies makes you afraid of water.
Of water?
Right.
Wow.
So he inoculated him with the full dose in the end, and it still didn't cause disease. So Joseph Meister was his name, was the first person who survived rabies in the world. The second was a 15-year-old shepherd dog from the Jura. He fought with a rabid dog to protect his fellow shepherd's friends.
Sheep, maybe.
No, I think it was just a bunch of young shepherds who were protecting sheep, and they got attacked by dogs and he got bitten. His case was more advanced because he got his first vaccination 7 days after being bitten, but he survived.
Wow.
He survived.
Were there lots? I'm just sort of curious. At the time, were there lots and lots of animals that had rabies?
Yes, it was endemic everywhere. It was everywhere. A girl, Louise Lepellier, she died even though she received the vaccine, but she was inoculated 37 days after she was bitten, which was much too late. So it's really important at the time, it was really important I think still to this day, if you're bitten by a wild animal, you need to get inoculated
right away.
Quickly.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was a kid, my mother would scare us. She'd tell us that we should be very wary of dogs, and I always loved dogs. But I was told I would have to get several shots and whatever. So if I didn't know the dog, I didn't touch the dog.
Right. Well, that is true.
I grew up in Toulouse city, but it was kind of the edge of the city back then. Jolimont was the edge of the city, if you can believe that.
For those of you who don't know, Toulouse is kind of silly now when you think about it.
It's very silly now, yeah. But so we still had like big fields and lots of. So the presence of rabid dogs was not impossible, I guess. But by now they inoculate. I think all over Europe they put rabies vaccine in bait. And they put it throughout areas where they see rabid rabies, and that's why we hardly ever see any cases anymore in Europe. But it's still very common in Africa, in lots of places. Yeah. I'm not sure if they inoculate wildlife in the U.S.
I don't know. I do know that growing up, we spent our summers in upstate New York, and we were aware of the fact that you had to be careful of foxes and raccoons because they were the ones that we were told, could be rabid. But I think I remember reading somewhere that at some point, at least in that part of the country, they were dropping food or something to give to the foxes, I think, so that they would not be rabid. But I don't know if it's all pervasive or not. I have no idea.
Yeah, but, I mean, by now, rabies is easily treated, but you do have to, And the vaccine that they administer today against rabies has hardly anything to do with the vaccine that Pasteur invented. Science has made so many inroads that the protocol is completely different. But it was based on his work. Right. So thanks to the success of the rabies vaccine, because by then people were like flabbergasted that finally at last somebody had found something against rabies, funds were donated from all over the world to build the Pasteur Institute, which was inaugurated in 1888, and Louis Pasteur was there to see the glorious day. This institute is dedicated to the science of vaccines in both human and veterinary medicine, and it's in the 15th. There's new Pasteur Institutes that spring up every year where the research needs to be done about specific diseases. It follows the pattern that he himself followed. He used to go study the disease where it was happening the most. That was his thing. Right. So, to conclude, there are some controversies surrounding Pasteur. He was definitely a man of his time. It's hard to believe that he did all his work without the contribution of any women scientists. Maybe he did, but I can't find that he credited any women for anything. So,
were there? Do you know if there were any women working with him at all?
I don't. But either way, it's appalling.
Yeah, well,
that he never picked women.
So,
right.
Really.
Yeah, it was a time. But it's he didn't pick women because he worked with a lot of young scientists. As a matter of fact, that's what he did everywhere he went. He would hire young scientists to run all these experiments for him, but no women. So okay. The bit about experimenting on prisoners that we mentioned earlier, I don't know that he did it, but he wasn't against it at all. Right.
Well, as you say, I mean, there were certain things that were done that were pretty awful at the time, and they were more or less they were just accepted. It's terrible. I mean, it sounds like he was someone. He was very much a scientist, but I don't think he was someone who had any social concerns particularly. You know?
Not a saint.
No.
He didn't like Germans either. Now, of course, he lived through the invasion of Paris by German soldiers.
True. Right.
So he developed a deep-seated hatred of all things German. He even asked them to take back honorary degrees that he received from German universities.
Really?
Yeah, he was not. And. To me, it's amazing that a man who trained in chemistry ended up making such huge strides in medicine.
That's true.
But that also means that he practiced medicines without a medical license.
Yeah.
So that's not good,
true,
right?
Too, yeah.
That's not good,
No.
It would not fly nowadays. But back then, he got away with it.
I guess it's a question of what you define as practicing medicine. If it's the idea of giving a vaccine, I guess kind of like a blurry line there.
Yeah, it's medicine for sure.
Yeah.
And of course, I didn't talk about it here, but he was really fastidious about cleanliness. As soon as he understood the germ theory, he was like, okay, we need to. He's at the origin of all the washing protocols that they have in medicine today, the autoclave, the sterile this and that. That's all because of him. And
I mean, it's so important, right?
It's vital. It's vital. And he was a bit OCD about hand washing himself. He was not a perfect person, okay? He was quite secretive about his research. He used to fly in rages against people. He was not a perfect guy. But just the fact that he brought so many inoculations for, diseases, not just in people, not just to help people, but veterinary medicine as well.
That's right.
Chicken cholera was extremely contagious, and it would kill a flock within a few days. Anthrax is terrible. There was a disease of domestic pigs. Anyway, he was an outstanding person, not a perfect person by any means. But today, at a time when we rely on vaccines, and we hope that a vaccine against COVID-19 is going to bring us back to normal life. It's important, I think, to remember that he started down this path long ago.
He did indeed, and I think that I don't think anybody expects somebody like that to have been. He wasn't a saint, but he was someone who was really a true scientist, and he advanced things enormously. So that's what matters. And one of the doctors who is one of the heads of the Pasteur Institute now is someone that I see on television regularly, who is an epidemiologist, and he's talking about the vaccine for COVID, and he's very good, and it makes you feel like, this is an institute that does the right thing. This is what we have, so.
And just on a personal level, I have to say that I find it really surprising that there are so many people in the world, even to this day, who fear vaccines more than they fear the disease.
Yes.
I think that's just the wrong approach. I have such people in my own family, so I know it happens.
Yeah,
but
I mean it's very complicated and it's very strange, but it does exist, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And well, I don't know what we can do about it. Except, one of the things, I was on one of the programs last night where this doctor is often, but he wasn't there last night, but they were talking about it last night because they were talking about this unsung woman who is the first person to have conceived of the concept that is now the one being used by Pfizer and all of these companies.
Turkish woman, right?
No, it's actually not even a Turkish woman. She was from someplace. Hungary. It's a very long story, but in the end, she's in Philadelphia, and as an immigrant, she came to the States in the 60s. But she sold her idea. Her idea was developed as working as a biochemist at the University of Pennsylvania. So, because she was working there, they own the rights to what she developed. So she makes no money from it, and that idea was then sold to Pfizer and the two Turkish Germans, who are a couple who are the ones who are working with Pfizer. So she did get some money off of it, but she has not received any of the recognition. But she is really the person who thought it. She's like Pasteur. She was the one who, through trial and error, when everyone was saying this is not possible, kept saying, yes, this could be what we can do. So hopefully one day she will have some recognition, because people who do these new things, it takes a long time for people to accept them.
It really does. All right, Elyse, thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for this podcast, and talk to you again soon.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us, Patreon. Join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you for many years now. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Scott R. and Carrie, that last name, Piesh? I'm going to say it the French way, Piesh, Carrie Piesh. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. And thank you also very much to Ernesto de Jesus for going to the yearly pledge. And also you give 50% more than the minimum amount. So thank you so much. I'll be sending postcards of Paris soon to my yearly patrons. It's not easy getting Paris postcards in a pandemic, but I found some. This week in French news, there's been lots of discussions of how France is doing such a poor job at getting the COVID-19 vaccine into people. It's slow and we're going to have to be patient. Things are speeding up a little bit, but we are definitely off to a slow start. Will it be the case of the tortoise and the hare? I hope so. French people were rather transfixed by the proceedings going on in America on Wednesday, and so was I. I have never seen my husband, who is American born and raised, so mad about politics, and he can get riled up about politics on a good day. So you can do better, America, and you will. In happier news, it's the season for Galette des Rois in France. That starts the second Sunday after Christmas, which was January 3rd this year. And it ends, well, whenever we're sick of eating those cakes. Usually late January in my case. It's a Catholic holiday officially called Epiphany. It celebrates the arrival of the Magi who came to worship baby Jesus. But in France, where religion is not at the center of everything, it's more of a family tradition and the cakes are tasty. There are two types of Galette des Rois. One is basically a brioche with big crystal sugar on top and sometimes candied fruit. That's my favorite, especially with the candied fruit. That one is also sometimes called couronne des rois, which means crown of kings. The second type is basically 2 sheets of puff pastry with something tasty in the middle. Generally, it's a preparation based on almond paste. I don't like almond paste, so when I make it, I use crème pâtissière, which is a kind of vanilla-flavored custard. Generally speaking, the puff pastry one is a Paris specialty, and the brioche kind is more common in the south of France. But you can find both everywhere in France, and which one you choose is a question of personal preference. The puff pastry kind is easier to make because getting brioche right takes a bit of skill and more time. So, now that you know all this, here's your French tip of the week. Both of those cakes are called Galette des Rois. Can you say that? Galette des Rois. But the Paris one with the puff pastry is called frangipane. Frangipane. Say it. Frangipane. Just to make sure it's clear, if you're buying frangipane, that's Frangipane, it will most of the time have almond paste inside. I warn you because I think almond paste is pure evil. That's an old story that I've told before on the podcast, so I won't subject you to it again. But also, this whole event is called Fêter les Rois. In a normal year, associations and groups of all kinds would get together pour fêter les rois. That means someone brings a few galettes. Often it's some of both kinds, actually. And usually you drink it down with cider. Could be sweet cider with very little alcohol or hard cider with more alcohol. And whoever gets the fève, that's the little ceramic thingy inside, is the queen or the king. They put on a paper crown and now they have to buy the next round of Galettes des Rois. Woohoo! This time of year, you find those Galettes des Rois everywhere in France. Bakeries make them, where they are usually sold for 10 euros and up. There's some pretty expensive ones. And you can find them also at the grocery store starting at 5 euros. You can make them at home as well. Neither one is all that difficult to make. It just takes a little practice and time, obviously. I mostly make mine at home, but there is one boulangerie-pâtisserie about 5 kilometers where I live that makes the best galette des rois. And so every year I go buy a few. But that's the one I want to imitate. Now, something I want to make clear is that they do not make galette des rois year-round, just around the Epiphany. Sometimes they start a little bit before Christmas and go until mid-February. But if you're in France at other times of the year, you're not going to see them at the store. But now that I'm planning on a second cookbook, don't know what I'll call it, maybe join us at the table again. I'm making them at home so I can refine my recipes. I made one last Sunday and one yesterday, and they were both quite good, but not perfect yet. You know, I will keep going until I have a recipe that works every time. Then I'll share it with my patrons so they can test it. So the patrons will be the recipe testers this time. I will need a few more tries, but it's coming. And another thing I did this week is that I made a calendar. It was kind of funny. I was puttering around my kitchen on Tuesday morning, and I went to turn the page on my wall calendar and realized that, that wall calendar is over. Oh! And we hadn't bought a new calendar this year. We normally have new calendars, because of the pandemic, and we haven't spent any time in stores, really, definitely no time at the mall. And the normal visits of local associations and organizations that sell calendars around France, they start in November and a lot of them come around in December. It's not happened this year, again, because of the pandemic. So I didn't have a new calendar to put on my wall. And I used Lulu print for the coil-bound and hardback versions of my cookbook. So I knew they also make calendars. So I made one. It features beautiful photos of France, and it marks French holidays, not American or Canadian holidays, French holidays. These are not my photos, but photos I chose where the owner has given explicit permission for these photos to be used for any reason. I assume most of you didn't make the same mistake I did and already have all the wall calendars you need for 2021. But if you'd like to see the photos I included or get one for yourself, go to joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Oh, and I also made a hedgehog video. I asked for a trail cam for Christmas, and I didn't get anything fancy, but it works wonderfully well. Hedgehogs are nocturnal, so it only comes out when I'm asleep. I knew we had hedgehogs in my garden because once in a great while, I see one in the garden, which is not a good sign, by the way, because only the ones who are unwell come out during the daytime. Anyway, a few years ago, I heard that hedgehogs are endangered in France, well, all over Europe, really. So I decided to give them a bit of help, and I provide kitten food and fresh water. And I also bought a hedgehog house on Amazon, but I didn't know if it was occupied or not. And it turns out that the answer is yes and no. I set up the habitat under a big bush that's right up against my house. There's a ton of mulch under that bush because I hate weeding. And when I say a ton of mulch, I mean like 20, maybe a foot or more of mulch, all right? So I put the habitat on top of the mulch. Then I put a big board over the habitat to protect it from rain. And I stuffed a lot of dead leaves all around the habitat. Well, if you go to the Join Us in France YouTube channel, you'll see that the hedgehog decided to tunnel around and under the habitat. It's got to be really warm down there because as mulch decays, it turns to compost, and that's hot. Every morning when I get up, I go check the trail cam and I see if the hedgehog came out. Some nights, like last night, it doesn't because it's freezing hard, -5°C last night in Toulouse. So they can hibernate for as long as up to 10 days in a row in the winter. But this hedgehog is mighty cute. I think there's only one, but I have no way to know. I mean, some people do like a paint splash on them so they can recognize them, but I don't want to go catch it. I don't want to go touch it. But I named it. It's very cute. I named it qui pique, which means the one that has stings. Qui pique. Piquer, to sting, right? So the one that stings. I don't know. I must be a softie. I like my birds, which I'm also feeding this time of year, and the hedgehog, and dogs, and cats, and people too. I'm a softie. What can I tell you? This week, I read a book set in France called Messandrières, a French murder mystery, a Jacques Fauré mystery, book 1 by Angela Wren. By Angela Wren. I got this one because it ranked pretty well in historical French fiction, but it's a disaster when it comes to being faithful to how things work in France. I'm not even sure the author ever lived in France for more than 2 seconds. The mystery is fine, but it doesn't feel like France at all, so I will not include it in my list of faves on Amazon, but I am working on a list of great books set in France for my boutique. It's not live yet. I will keep you updated. If you enjoy the show, introduce a friend to the podcast and show them how to listen. We're on all podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, Pandora, and you can ask your smart speaker to play Join Us in France. And of course, you can also listen on joinusinfrance.com and on YouTube too. Next week on the podcast, a most excellent episode with Sarah Smith about the Mayenne region of France. She moved there and knows the area very well. She has a lot of great ideas and suggestions, both about visiting that part of France and also moving to France. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2021 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.